So we're just about ready to start. I can start with I can see there's quite a few people joined us already. So hello and welcome to all of those people. I'll maybe just get a few housekeeping things out of the way and then hand over to Anthony for as our moderator for tonight. So I'll just introduce myself. I'm Robin Woolsey. I'm part of the team here at Deveron Projects. I work alongside Claudia. We keep things running. We work in Huntly in Aberdeenshire, and she'll talk a little bit more about that, I think. I would first like to say that we're so delighted to have so many people interested in this event and from all over the world as well. So welcome to everyone. Hope everyone's ready for an active discussion. A couple of housekeeping notes. This meeting is being recorded, so keep that in mind when you're asking questions. We will be taking questions throughout the whole chat, so please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function, and that will hopefully just try to answer as many as we can. We also would like to kind of continue this discussion on Twitter using the hashtag #BeingSocial. So we can just kind of keep this conversation going. I'm sure there'll be a lot of threads that people will want to keep picking up. And also there'll be a transcription of tonight's talk available later in the week. So with those kind of things out of the way, maybe I can hand over to our moderator, Anthony.
Well, thank you very much. So yeah, one of the reasons why we've definitely chosen to have the hashtag is because we realized that while most of us work in a socially engaged context, this is not a very socially engaged experience. So we're kind of hoping that there are multiple layers for you to engage on, in terms of if you're in the chat function, in the Q&As, you can answer that. In the Twitter function, we can have quite a few different ways to engage. Part of the reason why we can't necessarily socially engage with every one of 200 people is very much part of the technical limitations of this platform, but it's also really kind of part of the bigger question that we're kind of exploring, is how does socially engaged practice translate into a more online realm, and in what ways it can do that. And we're all learning through that process. And I'll probably keep holding this book up all the way through, which is by Lisbeth Huybrechts, which is Participation is Risky. And that is that question that part of the reason that we're trying to figure this out is that we are trying to figure it out. How do we really translate to a more online thing? So as we go forward, there's two terms that I just kind of want to quickly unpick very slightly, and that's to recognize that social practice is a problematic and contentious term. It generally can mean quite a few things. What I think the frame that we're kind of be talking in is how the term social practice refers to art and design, and how it links to art and design. And in that way, it's different from, say, regular practices such as social work. And that's not to say that social practice can't be linked to social work. It's just that its relationship to art and design makes it distinct in that sense. And the other term is the digital, which is also a complicated term. Generally, I think we can use it as something that is an electronic means to share information with each other. And that could be everything from Facebook to sharing photographs with each other over email. So it's a kind of a platform, so to speak. But both of these terms, I think we recognize, are really contentious, and I don't want to present a fixed terms of either, and we can kind of unpick that. So I'll give a bit of a background to my context and my work, and then I'm going to open up to some of the framed questions we talked about online that frames this, but I'll also then like to propose a few more questions to everyone else, and then I'll open it up to everyone talking. So I'm a socially engaged art practitioner who's worked within the field of 18 plus years. I've done work nationally and internationally, including with Deveron Projects several times. I also am a senior lecturer in cultural policy and arts management at Queen Margaret's University, and this includes being program leader for a new MA of applied arts and social practice. My research is quite embodied, I suppose. Both my research and my practice is very embodied. It's very physical. For example, Deveron 5 years ago now commissioned me to walk, Claudia commissioned me to, persuaded me, ordered me, I haven't decided on the words yet, to walk from Huntly in the north of Scotland to the Venice Biennale to explore the relationship between walking, social practice, what the art world means, and how that knowledge kind of was very physical, embodied knowledge. And so the interest of how we take the physical and translate it into something that's quite non-physical, such as the digital, is really interesting to me. My practice does involve other concerns. I'm really interested in the role of the rural arts in arts and health, and how practice-based work, i.e. participation, can exist in a more kind of productive space in the world. So my work, I suppose, just to kind of give you a little bit framework of it, is I'm interested in using participatory practices to kind of unpick and challenge the way that the world functions. I'm as liberal and lefty as they come, but I'm not necessarily interested in trying to replicate my worldview through my practice. I'm interested in how participation means I have to engage with other people who are not like me, and we have to interface in that world. So that's my interest in participation. And I think my job as a practitioner is to kind of explore the world from multiple perspectives, and how art can do that is really interesting to me. So that kind of then guides us into those questions. So we're guided by 5 questions, which we've decided before. And the first of these questions is, how do we deliver socially engaged practices, arts projects, when we can't meet face to face? Is social engagement possible during lockdown, during quarantine? What are the possibilities of the digital and beyond the digital? And what did the digital offer us as practitioners? What are the relationships with locality and community that we're working with in regards to the digital? And lastly, how can issues of justice, rights, and politics be heard by larger crowds? So those are the main kind of 5 questions that we have, and I'll come back to those before, but I kind of want to just problematize a couple of those before I turn to the first speaker. In some ways, we can think social practice is somehow intervening onto the world. So one of the projects I did with Deveron Projects was about fatherhood and intervening into notions of fatherhood with healthcare organizations, with families. And there are lots of examples in the digital why this happens. For example, Visible Projects works with the parliamentary television channel to be able to support projects online that invite people to be active citizens within the Parliament of France. So the aims of both of these works, both online and in the real world, was to kind of make change in some ways. But doesn't a platform like Twitter also do this? Individuals can already directly communicate with structures of power. People only need to look at tweets of certain national leaders to recognize that individuals can have real world impact. So if digital platforms gives individuals the tools for direct democracy, do we really need socially engaged practitioners? Do we really need socially engaged artists? Or is that just about us trying to persuade the world to think like that? Or is that about our own authorship and our own ego? A second question is, what is the role of the curated socially engaged practices? What I mean by that is people are already engaged in the digital realm. I log on Facebook every day and I engage with people and I design my things and I send photographs. And in some ways, I'm more creative in my online space than I am in my real life space. So how does the idea of a curated online socially engaged practice function in that? You can consider, for example, online gaming. Online gamings are places where loads of people develop deep, profound friendships that last many years and are just as relevant than the relationships we form in the real world. Why should socially engaged artists intervene into that space? Should we have the curated in that? The second to last question is something about age and generation. The people speaking today generally are of a certain age, and I'm not going to say what age that is, but are we concerned about the digital because we weren't birthed within the fires of the internet? I think of my nephew at 18 and 19, who is so fluid in this language, and yet I am not. And so maybe is the concern we have about the digital fundamentally because we weren't born from that language? And the last question I have is, the digital seems to remove the need for the geographic. Someone in Huntley can come together with someone in Japan over a shared love of a game, of a particular cooking style, where they're both interested in a certain TV show. But there's less relationship between people in the same local. For example, someone in Huntley might not be engaging on a digital platform with someone who lives down the road. And does the digital necessarily kind of prejudice it towards a global outlook rather than the local? Before I turn to the panelists, I was reading a phrase by Chiano Achebe in Things Fall Apart. And he says, "A man calls his kinsmen to a feast. He does so not to save them from starving. They already have food in their own homes. When we gather in a moonlit village on the ground, it is not because of the moon. Every man can see it from his compound. We come together because it is good for kinsfolks to do so. So the concept of coming together is really interesting to me, and I'm wondering how the digital can increase, challenge, make us rethink a lot of the ways that we come together." So I'll move on. I'll reassert some of those questions when we come back to the kind of discussion. But right now, I'd like to turn on to the panelists. And first, I'm going to introduce Claudia Zeiske, who is just below me now. I don't know where she is for you in your world. But Claudia is the founding member and director of Deveron Projects. And this is an organisation based in Huntly in Aberdeenshire in the northeast of Scotland. It's committed to connecting people through creative research and engagement. Her balanced approach lies between artist criticality and community involvement with artists from across the globe, including our very own locality. Claudia is also a keen walker, and much of her work considers the human pace by bringing walking and other journeying activities together with artists and people from all walks of life. Claudia?
Okay, well, I see you just below me here. So interesting. Thank you very much and welcome everybody. We hope we have a good discussion afterwards. It's a bit of a shame that we can't see each other so well, but this is just how it works because we have over 200 people subscribed here today, and we want to make sure that we are not phasing out. So I'm the director of Deveron Projects here in Huntly, and I'm sharing my screen now in the very old-fashioned way, as Anthony already indicated, of a PowerPoint. And bear with me. Here we go. And I do this like this. Okay, so for those who don't know me or us, we are based in Huntly, which is a small town of about 4,000 people in the north of Scotland. The nearest town is Aberdeen, and it's in the north of Scotland, about 4 hours away from Edinburgh. And we have no art center and no gallery, but instead for us, the mantra is the town is the venue. And it takes about 10 minutes to walk from one end to the next, a bit like the Tate Modern. So this is our gallery from outside, and this is our gallery from inside. This is a bit like today, this morning. The weather has become better this afternoon. But anyway, this is where we are. And we have a sort of a godfather, and he's called Patrick Geddes. He also comes from Aberdeenshire, and he coined the triptych place, work, folk. Place, work, folk is really sort of always in our mind for our projects. You know, is this conundrum between artist and community and hospitality and criticality and outside on insides and local and global. And to his credit, also the slogan "Act locally, think globally," as he has coined this phrase. And this is where is our starting point. So here, this goes a bit fast, but anyway, act local, start here. So over the years, we exist for 25 years and have worked with 100 artists, roughly 100 artists, and on roughly 100 projects. And so we worked on issues of identity. We always look at local issues or local topics, but that also have a sort of global and universal links. So it's issues of identity, of history, of environment, in this case in transport. This was with the artist Jacqueline Donaghy from Glasgow. But here with the French artist, we made a kind of contribution, sort of thinking about war and peace 100 years after World War I. And we never shied away from any political topics, including health and very social issues, such as fatherhood, like in the case with Anthony, or even religion, like what you can see here with the Ugandan artist, Sana Kadeja. And so anyway, for us, over the years, we have integrated ourselves in the community, and sort of the butcher, the baker, and the artist, they're all sort of equally play a part in our town. But, so I think all our projects have something in common, and they try to bring people together. How do we do this if we can't physically meet? So here, this was ourselves on our 25th birthday, and this is us now. Sorry, I wanted to say this is the kind of methods we have been using, sort of planting for example, eating together and cooking together, and walking has been a big part of our methodology as well. Always different kind of activities that bring people together. But how do we do that now? You probably have seen these kind of pictures a lot yourself in your own families and your groups. This is a farewell party for our good old friend Joss, who worked with us for 6 years, and he left our work just 2 weeks after COVID started and the lockdown started. Now, this is a very different way of meeting each other, and that really prompted me, how can we work in future? And therefore, I'm looking for advice and a discussion, how can we do this with yourselves today? Now, I wanted just to point something out, is that working digitally has never been sort of, although we always focus on socially engaged art, has never been sort of strange to us. You probably saw that painting when you signed on Eventbrite, and that has been made by an artist called Mai Murad. And with her we worked. Mai Murad is from the Gaza Strip, and she could not come to us for her residency, and neither could we even visit. And so what we did, we teamed her up with another artist called Rachel Ashton. Both are painters. And the project they did is they took each other for walks in their own places. And here you see Rachel on a walk in our woods, and May in the Gaza Strip going for a walk as well. And in the end, they were asked to paint each other's places rather than their own. And so, and at the very end, we did a slow marathon that we do every year here in our place on the topic of walking without walls. And so I wanted to illustrate that topic. And basically, it sort of jogged our thinking. And then a project we are now trying to set up is a global slow marathon. We had planned a slow marathon. A slow marathon is a marathon length walk that we have been doing every year in the spring. And but you can do it as slow as you like. In fact, if you're the slowest, you're the winner. But normally we do it in one day, and we always do it to a political topic. So politics has always been a big part of our work, and I really look forward to discuss this also in the lights of recent situations that we have, whether it is Brexit, where we did a big project with an artist from Berlin, or whether it is what happened just this week around Black Lives Matter. Anyway, slow marathon this year, we try to bring a real global community together through walking just in their own place and collect miles to walk ourselves and together around the world, from Huntly and back to Huntly from the other side. So I am looking for a good and inspiring conversation, how to best do this, and also for some advice on how to proceed in the times to come, because I'm worried this could last for a long time for us. Anyway, I stop talking now and stop sharing.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, Claudia. That's very good of you. I would like to then now ask Babak to speak. And just before he does, I'll just give him a short introduction. Babak is a digital artist who often creates apps that can be experienced through mobile devices and screens. He's currently in Brazil, although his work and projects have taken him all over the world. He was working on the ICT4D, Information and Communication and Development, before it even had a name. Among his many projects, Babak has developed and co-created a wide range of apps which allow users to get lost or find new ways to interact with their surrounding, particularly in urban areas. Take it away, Babak.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, guys. I think the questions that you posed earlier on as an introduction, I think are very valid, basically coming down to whether or how digital and technology can be used in social practices. And whether they should or how, and for me, it's so extremely obvious that they have to. There is no alternative, really. So for me, the question has a very obvious answer. And I'll try to illustrate that with a few of the projects that I've worked on over the last 2 decades. And also going in just a minute, and also going back to the point you raised earlier about how maybe we didn't grow up with technology and therefore are wondering more whether this should be part of our practices or not. I'm a mathematician by trade. I've got a master's in maths, and for me, I started my professional life as a developer. So maybe that's also why I think it's obvious. Anyway, so I'll also share my screen. Oh. Here we go. Like so. Yeah. All right. So the question that I wanted to focus on for this very small presentation is whether face-to-face meetings are a requirement for social practices. And although nothing, I think, replaces face-to-face encounters, they are not a requirement for socially engaged practice or for artistic practice in general. And I've got two projects here listed that I worked on. One of the very early ones is called SowetoUprisings.com. It's sadly no longer online. It was online for 12 years. And what that was, but you see a screenshot on the right, what that was a collection of oral histories of the June 16, off the top of my head, 1976 Soweto uprisings in South Africa. And what we did, and I created this together with a local or South African artist and researcher, is we collected oral histories and mapped them out on a very early version of Google Maps, where also people could contribute their own experiences to this environment. So they could add stories, they could add photos, they could add audio. So it became a collaborative meeting point, if you will, for experiences that in 2006 happened 30 years before, and are often seen as the start of the end of apartheid in South Africa. And this very much relied on the digital, although these people to some extent also met in person. And many of these people were no longer living in one place. They were all over South Africa or all over the region. And this gave them a platform to actually come together again. So that's one example. And another is very recent, something that only went live last Monday is, it's Portuguese because it's focused on Brazil. And it's about the requests for impeachment of Bolsonaro. And although this is more a journalistic piece, it cannot exist outside of the online realm. This is a place where people can read up on all the impeachments, can send messages to Parliament to stay up to date as to the progress of these impeachments, and can also interact online with each other. So face-to-face is not a requirement, but it helps, but it's not a necessity. In fact, you could even say, or at least for many of my projects, if not all of them really, digital is the driver for the implementations of these projects. They cannot exist without the digital aspect. Here are two more recent examples of exactly that. The first is called 100, which are 100 stories by 100 families from Rio de Janeiro who were displaced due to or because of the World Cup and the Olympics that took place in Rio. People were kicked out of their homes were razed to the ground, and then they were moved to a completely different part of Rio de Janeiro. And so these stories were collected and then mapped and made accessible to the wider public. And you see a screenshot on the right of the homepage of this website that still exists. And another is also a recent example, which is an online collaborative platform for walking artists. And these two things also cannot exist without the digital. But maybe you could argue these are less artistic projects. They're all more collaborative online environments. That might be true. But my personal bugbear is the question as to how to subvert the tyranny of the corporate map. And this is based on ideas of the situationists from the 1950s mostly. And if you're not so familiar with the situationists, What they pioneered were ideas and concepts to fight to fight against the commercialization of public space, and what they called the spectacle. And they identified the idea of psychogeography and the dérive, sort of like how a place makes you feel, to counter how the urban environment tells us how to move and how to behave. And the dérive, basically, for the situationists, was a way to put agency back into the individual. And what I did with also a South African artist in 2012 was we created an app called Dérive app, which is an implementation of these ideas, where the user is presented with task cards that make the user look at his environment differently. Using similar ideas, what I created later in 2015, the app is no longer available, is Kompel, which was similar in its ideas, but in practice was more, it was called by the independent Pokemon Go for the real world. Also taking away agency from the mapping tools that all of us are now using all the time, and putting more control back in the hands of the user themselves. There are a few others that I list here. One that is also that I think is also very interesting is the Museum of Yesterday, also set in Rio de Janeiro, where users have to physically explore the city to experience the history of the city through narratives, stories, photos, video, audio, to learn about, well, the good and bad parts of the history of the city. So all of these are examples where the digital is essential to the practice, and the product cannot exist without the digital. Maybe what's nice is to show you a little bit of one of the apps and to show you the collaborative nature of the implementation. I'm going to take a look at the Dérive app for a minute. Sorry for this, nice graph. Here we are. So what the Dérive app does is it presents you with task cards to nudge you into experiencing the city around you slightly differently from how you would otherwise. And this is an example of a task card. Follow a cat for a few blocks if you can. And well, you have to wait 30 seconds before you can go to the next card, so we'll wait a tiny little bit. How this works really is that this nudges you into an experience that is completely different from how you would normally experience your environment. And it works specifically well in places that you think you know, where you have stopped looking at your surroundings because you think you are familiar with them. And this brings back the unfamiliarity, if you will. There's another card, walk, turn left when you see someone selling flowers. Now, what we also did 3 years ago, so the app dates back to 2012, what we did 3 years ago was add the idea of hosted dérives. This is where anyone who participates at the same time gets presented with exactly the same cards wherever they are in the world. So they get the same nudges, but they are probably in completely different places and probably even in completely different cities in different countries. But they're nudged in the same way, but their experience, of course, is very different. While they are, going back to the situationists, taking back agency of the experience. And that's where I wanted to leave it for now, if that's okay.
Super. Thank you so much, Babak. And that was very interesting to hear. So we'll now go have a short presentation from Suzanne. Suzanne probably needs very little introduction. She's a renowned pioneer and socially engaged in public performance art. Her installations, videos, and performances deal with the sexual violence, rural and urban poverty, incarceration, labor, and aging. Her work spans from visual art, film, performance art to installation, public practice, and writing. She's professor at the Roski School of Art and Design at the University of Southern California and a resident artist at the 18th Street Arts Center. I don't know if you want to mention or anything before you begin, Suzanne, or before you pass on to the video, but the floor is yours.
Well, I think that as just a brief introduction, I remember in the 90s when a conference on digital, they asked me to do a a keynote on organizing through digital media. And at the time, which was early, I guess, mid-1990s, I said I was not really interested. I had said I had nothing to offer to that, and I wasn't even sure how you would do it. And I've been proven so dramatically wrong over the last few years, with everything from Black Lives Matter to the digital uprising from Arab Spring. And I tend to think of the digital and the haptic as potentially things to put in relationship to each other, but not necessarily anything that I would create a judgment on. I think there are different things you get when you speak in front of people. In fact, in 3 weeks in January, and I think it was 2013, I revisited a project on rape and tried both organizing around rape stories online and through Twitter and various forms of social media, and in live organizing. And we were very much looking at the relationship between what kinds of stories came forth from women on the digital platform that didn't come forth in haptic environments. And so for me, all of it's about the fundamentals of communication. I'm working right now on a project in Moscow that there's a huge museum, VAC Foundation, that's being made in the middle. It's being a Renzo piano renovation in the middle of Moscow. And there are people who are very committed to this organization being about engagement of people from multiple communities. So we're working on a project where we're experimenting with these forms of media. We're starting with a telebridge where people in the community talk to workers on site of this museum electronically to each other through a live media transmission. And then we're going to sort of gradually move toward intimate haptic conversations with the people at the foundation of this building and people in the foundations of the community. So I think that what I wanted to show you today, last week when we were talking, I wanted to show you a video that Andrea Bowers and I put together. Andrea Bowers is a very important activist feminist artist in the United States, and she works in labor issues. She works on violence against women, and works digitally through film and installation. And we've had collaborations over the years. And in the middle of the lockdown, we were sort of anxious about what should we be doing as artists. All of our exhibitions were postponed. I'm not super interested in only digital work, but we decided over the course of 3 days to put together a video with friends of ours for Earth Day. This video recreated or restaged a script from, not a script, but a book from Susan Griffin, who was one of the early ecofeminists from the 70s. And I'd like to show you that real quickly. And this is the project with Andrea Bowers, and it's a project addressing Earth Day ecology. Go ahead.
Here we are.
As I go into her, she pierces my heart.
As I penetrate further, she unveils me.
When I have reached her center, I am weeping openly.
I have known her all my life, yet she reveals stories to me. And these stories are revelations, and I am transformed.
Each time I go to her, I am born like this.
I am born like this.
Her renewal washes over me endlessly.
Her wounds caress me.
I become aware of all that has become between us.
Of the noise between us, of the blindness.
Of something sleeping between us.
Of the noise between us, of the blindness, of something sleeping between us.
No, my body reaches out to her. They speak effortlessly.
and I learn at no instance does she fail me in her presence.
She is as delicate as I am.
She is as delicate as I am.
She is as delicate as I am.
I know her sentience. I feel her pain, and my own pain comes into me.
And my own pain grows large.
And I grasp that pain in my hands and I open my mouth
To this pain.
I taste, I know, and I know why she goes on under great weight
with this great thirst.
In drought, in starvation.
in drought, in starvation,
with intelligence in every act.
with intelligence in every act. Does she survive disaster?
Does she survive disaster?
This earth is my sister.
I love her daily grace, her silent daring.
And how loved I am.
And how loved I am.
How we admire the strength in each other.
How we admire the strength in each other. All that we've lost, all that we've suffered.
All that we've suffered, all that we know.
We are stunned by this beauty, and I do not forget.
What she is to me, what I am to her.
Okay, so the sound was not synced on that. That's actually a better produced than it appeared. But it really shows, you know, basically a 5-day effort where Andrea and I wanted to respond to a Serpentine Gallery call out for projects on Earth Day. Given, if I could show the other video, what do you think, Claudia, Robin, is that for just, it's 3 minutes, and I won't say much except that, you know, we've been, I'm really focused right now on what's happening in the United States and globally, and the tremendous inflection point that we're going through in terms of race relations. And I think this is a moment where it's very clear that the digital has played a massive role along with the haptic. And what happened in Los Angeles just yesterday, I've been crying all day about it, is you could see these people sitting, you know, right next to each other, masks in the midst of the pandemic, thousands of people sitting next to each other in front of the mayor's house very peacefully. You could see police officers interacting with them, and they knew exactly where to go, and they knew what kinds of hashtags, and there's a communication system that's happening globally right now based on the digital, but the haptic is also coming through, ironically, through the digital, through television, through social media. That's still coming through in ways that I think I can't sort through it yet, but I think it's a really important moment where these forms of communication are coming together. So I don't know if you want to show that quick 3-minute clip. It's from a project in the 90s. Go ahead, Robin. On the same issue that's been going on forever in our culture.
I haven't had a single positive experience in my life. So look,
to tell you the truth, I couldn't be around police without my stomach turning.
In
10 years as a police officer, I have never seen a police officer hit a person that's been handcuffed. I'm not saying that that does not happen. Obviously, it happens, but I have never seen it.
It happened in Riverside to a young girl. What are you talking about? That never happened. I get shot down. I get shot down. Now, because you're a cop and because you made a mistake that I was reaching for something and because you ran my name and 4 years ago I have something on my record, I got shot and it's okay. You may not even lose your job. And that's how you're above the law. And you can't, and you have to admit that.
Let me give you an example. A decorated cop, all right? 15 years in the force, kicking ass. The whole 15 years he's on.
Kicking ass the whole 15 years.
Meaning he's been making, hey, that's right. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a good cop. I didn't say he was doing anything against him. I'm talking about a good cop. 15 years on the streets, all right? Everybody knows him. Everybody likes him in the department. Citizens like him. He goes out there and makes a mistake like that. What do you think should happen to him? Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah. That's your attitude, though. Hey, that's what I thought. That's what I thought. A good cop like that probably has 10 more years on the streets. He makes one freaking mistake. That's how people are. Screw him, get him out of there.
15 years on the street, kicking ass, whatever, right? He makes one mistake, but we're on the streets, and we make one mistake, and what happens to us?
Make one mistake, meaning what? One mistake about what?
25 to a L.
Break the law.
I don't understand what you mean when you say that.
Like, breaking the law. She's saying if young people break the law, they don't get a second chance.
That's not true. That is not true.
Especially not young.
That is
not
not
true at all.
True.
We just got done. We got here late here on a case where a guy just paroled after doing what 3 years for murder. He did 3 years for murder. Okay, so there are second chances.
Thank you very much for that all. It's pertinent to see that conversation happening again after all this time. And yeah, thank you very much for sharing with that, Suzanne. I'd like to move now into perhaps a discussion between us before we kind of open up to some Q&As. As Robin said before, if you have any specific questions that are pertaining to each one of us as the panel members, please do include it in the chat, or if you have any other questions. And please do try to use the Q&A function rather than the chat. But I kind of want to start with something Babak says and offer it up to you, to the three panelists, to see what they think. And obviously, if the panelists have other questions for each other, please let us talk together. But Babak, you said in passing, nothing replaces the face-to-face. And we're thinking of the digital in this term. And Suzanne, you talked about the relationship that the digital can have to the haptic or the real life in that sense. But is the digital that we are looking on now, do we need to think about it as a different medium entirely, or do you think of it as a tool that it's just a tool in the same way that a community center is a tool? Or are you thinking of it in some ways that we can really kind of challenge different ways of thinking? Just to say, Claudia, you're muted in case you want to answer. Do either of you, I open that up. Is the digital always going to be secondary to face-to-face?
I'll take that. I think the answer is no. I think the answer is no. Whatever the digital is in practice, right? It could be a phone, but it can also be a video camera. To what extent it's a tool. Whatever it is, whatever the technology is, it's a tool. So it's no different in that sense than a pen, say. But depending on what the piece is or what you're conveying, it can be a very important tool or not very important tool, or the most important tool. If we go back to, although that's not really an artistic practice, but if we go back to the Arab Spring uprisings, they could not have existed without Twitter, right? So of course, it was a tool, but it was the reason without which it could not have existed. And there is only going to be more of that because everyone, well, maybe we're not yet, but everyone that's younger than us is pretty much in the global north is digitally native. Mm-hmm. So,
Suzanne, I saw you shaking your head in that way as well.
Well, I think it's a tool. I mean, I think that people in LA are already used to remote relationships. I talk to my best friend by phone every day. I think that I'm thinking about it seriously in terms of what it's going to mean for my practice, because so much of my practice is built on really direct, intimate relationships with people in very specific places. And I maintain those relationships for years. And I learn about those cultures and those places from actually physically being there. So I think I'm going to have some problems not relying on airplanes. But I think that it won't stop social practice, art, nor activism. And what I really liked about what Babak said was the relationship in his presentation is he brought up whether it was art. And I think that one of the interesting things about all forms of social practice is it sort of blurs the boundary between art and activism. And that's a very interesting boundary for us to explore. But I think that in as much as I used to work with news media or television, or they're all, for me, forms of communication. The gallery and the museum is a form of communication, that's all. It's a place where communication takes place, and it has certain kind of hierarchies and certain structures, but it's all the same thing. It is, what is it that we collectively or individually or in some relationship to the two, what do we have to express, and how do we want to mobilize people? Otherwise, to me, they're just forms of communication, and they have positives and negatives. I mean, would Trump be Trump without Twitter?
Don't even want to think what that would be, but yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, he does, you know, he's defined through that medium, isn't he? There is it does beg the question though about I suppose, and I'm sorry if I'm jumping on the question that Mandy McIntosh asks. If you wanted to ask this in person, please feel free to do that on the video. But Mandy was asking, what about digital poverty in that context? You know, there are. Babak, you talked about the global north, and so how are we then engaging with those people, or should we be engaging with those people who are not in the same digital realm in us, and how do we then engage that? Is that hierarchy that you talk about within the digital something that we need to address, and is that a structural thing? Do we do that creatively? In what ways? Maybe Claudia, you can speak to that as someone who's worked in a lot of, I suppose, non-traditional global north contexts.
Yeah, I wanted to answer that. I think we're very concerned about that because Huntley itself, so I'm always talking from our own place as a starting point, as I said before, is not a wealthy place. And you will find that there is a lot of digital poverty. And we even were faced with people that we know personally, and where we had to go out of our way to really help them the moment this situation started. But then, of course, there are people that we don't know personally, and all we can do is help on Facebook and say, well, can we help you somehow? But then they can't read the Facebook, you see. And this is, and even our local paper, the Huntley Express nowadays, comes only out digitally. People normally don't buy it anymore. So that is a huge issue. It has been an issue all the time, and it is an issue also for in particular school children who then can't take lessons at the moment because all the lessons are taking place online, and all the learning is taking place online. But the digital poverty is not just about poverty related to money. It is also what was earlier mentioned. It is to do often with age and education. And so if people, in particular, people, older people, and I already start counting myself to it because a day like this can get me quite stressed, and so sort of there's a lack of intuitive understanding of that. Is also, one could also call it a form of digital poverty. So it is something that really one can't underestimate, that how many people are actually excluded by all these possibilities.
Do we take that same approach that we did in sort of social inclusion in the UK and elsewhere, where we have a policy by which we try and engage with those people who aren't engaging in the right kind of cultural way with the digital, or is that a more infrastructural thing that needs to be addressed by governance that we as artists in the real world and the digital can address, or how do we as practitioners address that digital poverty question?
I mean, it was interesting, like in the last election, that Jeremy Corbyn said he would get everybody in the whole country internet. So that was an amazing, to me, that would have been just a winner, but he didn't win. Obviously here on a local basis, one can help. One could really, if one was prepared a bit more, we could have probably really done something about it. Yeah, I think it is something that really is an important thing. I just wanted to actually also come in into another thing that Babak just said, and that is about the linking, and that the Arab Spring would have never happened without the digital. So that's diverting now from the poverty thing. But this is probably true, but then on the other hand side, rallies and uprisings have happened before the digital. Yeah. And myself, I've been in my student times in the 80s. I was in Berlin, and we had the Cold War, and we were very, very upset about the fact that there was so much nuclear power being stationed in our own country and in Europe. And people did an amazing rallies. They were not smaller than nowadays the rallies are. There was, for example, organized between a town called Ulm and another town called Stuttgart, where both there were Pershing stations from America. There's a distance of 180 kilometers, and they built a human chain of people on this 180 kilometers. And I have no idea, nowadays I would love to meet the organizers, how logistically they have done it, without internet, without mobile phones or anything. But we all turned up there, and we knew exactly where we had to stand and hold hands, and there was a helicopter above us who was filming the place. And there was for about 10 minutes, people were holding hand in this human chain. So one should remember that loads of things were happening actually also before the digital.
It's interesting because you might be able to argue in some ways that we are more connected now through the digital, and yet we are less connected somehow at the same time. You know, I don't know if you and your practitioners, if Babak or Suzanne want to be able to speak to that, is, you know, yes, technically with this little machine I can contact anyone and I could do those sorts of things, but there seems to be less of a cohesive experience. And I wonder if that's where the as Suzanne, you talked, the very intimate face-to-face kind of entrenching of relationships is required. Can we only go so far with the digital in terms of our relationships with people, but actually fundamentally we need to get to that face-to-face in the end.
Or Suzanne?
No, Babak, go ahead.
I do totally agree that technology can also be limiting, right? Or isolating, which is, I think, what you're speaking to with that. But I think what has shifted, maybe the most important thing that has shifted with the advent of easily accessible technology is that we expect things to move much faster than we did 30 or 40 years ago. Like what Claudia is giving as an example about her demonstrating in Germany, it just took lots more time to arrange these things 30 or 40 years ago, because you couldn't just send everyone a tweet. But going back to the start of this section about digital poverty, I think a broader term that I think is more applicable is accessibility, because that also speaks to people who are blind or who are deaf. And if you're deaf, you can go online and you can tweet, but if you're blind, it's a bit of a problem. And for that, you don't have to live in the global south, right? So what then the question I think comes down to is, how can we make digital tools accessible to those who, for whatever reasons, cannot access the content in the same way that we do? And that can be because you don't have the smartphone, or it can be because you don't have the high-speed internet, or it can be because you are blind. And depending on the context, what it is that you're trying to convey, you just have to make your product accessible. That's it.
I mean, it's the same with art. Sorry, Suzanne, please go ahead.
Yes, yeah.
Well, I think that the issue of accessibility is a governmental issue. I know in Bristol, the city, the people that I've worked with in Bristol, England, people have been trying for years to create more digital access for people in, for example, Know West, the Know West Media Center. And I think that is the role of the government, that they should be providing us tools of communication as we can. But I want to remind us that even if we're not able, we in the global North and West are not able to reach people who don't have access to digital. There are artists and there are activists in those communities who are in fact engaging. So for me, it goes back to this issue of what are the different aspects and functions, weaknesses and strengths of these forms of communication. Somebody said, I think Babak, you were talking about, you send a tweet and people assemble. And I think the interesting question there is, yes, we can gather people much quicker through social media. You can get them to meet on a corner. But I think what happens is you can get them to meet on a corner and act the way they already think that they're supposed to be acting. I think it's harder to, with a tweet, get people to meet on a corner and act in a new way. And a lot of what any activist or social practitioner or social artist is trying to do is to rethink the forms of interaction. I know I challenge the notion of protest as the only viable way of communicating politically. It's an effective one, an important one. But when you tweet, show up on the corner and protest George Floyd, you're going to get a very specific set of activities. And I think within that haptic environment, people experiment with other ways, with taking a knee, with police officers, for example, with shaking hands, with hugging, and so on. They experiment within that haptic environment. But the digital notice to go someplace doesn't always get you to a different place.
So we actually have a question here that kind of relates to that quite well. So I think I'll direct it to you, Suzanne, from Orla Tracy. She asks, how do we create deep and meaningful conversations between strangers using digital platforms like Twitter and Facebook? They are very shallow platforms that don't allow for a deep learning of another person or a deep understanding of a context of a topic, issue, or place. And they allow for a lot of anonymity, which leads to some nasty chat, in Orla's opinion. What are the panelists' thoughts on this?
Can I just add to that question is that we must remember also questions like Twitter and Facebook, you know, there are algorithms that do keep people in silos, you know, so we can, yes, tweet a bunch of people to join on the street corner, but we're only going to get those people that we want, that we are already connected with. We're not going to get the people that we're not already connected with. But that question, I think that Orla asks about how do we get a deeper, more profound engagement on those platforms, I think is a very interesting one. I don't know if Babak or
to see if Babak can answer that as probably the person with the most sophistication about the materiality.
I do have an answer, but I cannot answer the question. But the answer is the following. If I would not ask this question about Twitter or Facebook or online, but about going to the pub on my street corner, how is that any different? How do I have a meaningful conversation with someone that I meet in the bar? Well, there's no short answer for this. It depends on the person. It depends on the bar. It depends on me. It depends on the time of the day. It depends on what I drink. It depends. So I don't know.
But it requires bravery. And it requires a certain context for me to walk up to a stranger in a bar, because I know how to access that person, and I know how to then, and I'm open enough to go, hi, I want to talk to you about a stranger. But if I'm on, how do I even know where to go to meet a stranger online? You know, you can't type into Google, I want to meet a stranger. I'm sure there is a website, I want to meet a stranger. But
yeah, there are chat rooms.
Yeah, sure, but you know what I mean in that way.
But I think.
Oh yeah, but you have to make. Sorry.
I think you can break down some of the differences between a face-to-face communication. We've been talking about it in terms of teaching online. How do we notice the expressions? I read people when I'm sitting in a group of people. I'm constantly watching. Is somebody going like this, or is somebody looking directly, or is there a sadness that's moving in the eyes? Yeah, you can tell when somebody's about to cry, and you simply stop and wait, and you will suddenly dip to a deeper level of conversation. And I do think that can take place online, but I think right now it's probably in more intimate environments. And people are experimenting with that. They're doing online dating apps. They're doing online dating. I have drinks with friends that are pretty hysterical. Andrea Bowers and Lucia and San Ramon and I had a before dinner drink the other night, and it was quite funny and intimate. So I think we're experimenting with those forms now. I don't think we've used them that way, but we have used film that way. You can show a film and be deeply moved and have your experience completely changed. I was watching television yesterday and crying watching television. So I think we have to really break down what is it that we get when we actually talk to people? What is it that comes through? And a lot of it is scale and facial.
I might argue with that in that sense is that it's not just the communications. I don't know how to prove this. I think there's something innately profound about us being physical bodies together. And I go back to, and I can't help but go, you know, we're biologically built to be in groups. Yeah. And right now, I'm not in a group with you. I'm alone in my room, and the sensations that you are having and the sensations that I'm having of my body are different from you. So while we are at the same time here, we're not together. We're not bound together by our same physical kinesthetic experience. And that's to me the fundamental collapse in the digital, is that actually...
But it's taking place with yoga lessons. It's taking place with online meditation sessions and the dating and so on. What I'm saying is it's a moment of experiment with that kind of extraction. And I think in the same way we've learned to be very direct and intimate with phone conversations, I think that there will be a learning that'll take place. And yes, there probably are phenoms and other kinds of electronic communication going back and forth between bodies that won't be replaced this way. But I do think that we'll learn deeper layers of intimacy.
I hope so.
So there's a question again that relates to that that's just come in from Junior Aguar, and it's how can we ensure an organic transition between online and haptic engagement? And Suzanne, there was also a question about whether you could define what you mean by haptic engagement.
I'll say that first, and then we can all address the other issue. What I mean by haptic is the direct physical experience that takes place with people when they are in the physical presence of each other. So for me, it's very much about all the cues we've been talking about embodiment, about touching, feeling, tasting, you know, the senses that are not necessarily activated, at least in my experience, through digital.
Robin, could you remind us of that question? I've already forgotten the earlier part from Junior. Hello, Junior.
Sure. It was, how can we ensure an organic transition between online and haptic engagement?
Gosh, I wonder if that's possible if they're doing different things. You know, in some ways, in my practice, I would see the digital as very much a tool. It's a mechanism to, as you say, get the people to the street corner, and then something else happens on the street corner. But I don't know if I could ever. That's a very hard one. I don't know if that translation happens as easily.
Yeah, I can maybe say a little bit about this. The thing with physical experiences, like if we're in the same room, we get a lot of social cues from the way other people behave, right? And when we're in a Zoom meeting, I have still some of these social cues available to me and you to you, because we see the five of us, right? So if I say something stupid, I can see it in your faces that I said something stupid, but I can't see it in the faces of the 149 people who I can't see, right? So those social cues I do not have. So what we move to, and this is happening, is using different social cues to identify where we are as an individual within the conversation that we're having with other people on the same platform. So instead of looking at looking at you where your eyes are to tell me whether I'm saying something smart or not, I look at the interpunction that you use on Twitter, or if I'm presenting on TikTok, I've got one eye in the corner to see whether the hearts come up or thumbs up or other emoji, right? So those are ways to convey meaning to the conversation, and they are very different from what I prefer, but that's just how it is now, right? So how do we transfer, how do we ensure an organic transfer? Yeah, with difficulty, because we are moving to a completely different set of social cues. You just have to be open.
And you have to learn the new language. You know, you have to understand all of those emojis and all of those, those emojis that, you know, my brother and I tried to have an entire conversation with emojis and only emojis, and then talk to each other about what we thought that conversation was about. And, completely different.
In a way.
He was ready to disown you, but...
Yeah.
There is actually another question, I guess, that maybe can comment on that too, from Nicole Manley. She's asking, can the digital blur the boundaries of reality? In maybe in a similar way that you have a conversation with your brother, consisting all of emojis. Is this another form of reality? A greater amount of constant information. This from Nicole. Conspiracy theories. What is real? The physical as opposed to the virtual. The main question, can the digital blur the boundaries of reality?
Yeah, and I wonder if there's going to be a rejection. And it was just one of the questions that I was hoping that we would get to, and I might just throw it onto it, is will you see, because of COVID and this situation, we have been forced to translate onto online, do the rest of the panelists sort of foresee a rejection of that? You know, once there's a time to be able to leave, you don't have to be in quarantine. There will be people who, you know, another subset of species of humans who go, no, I do not want to live online. I choose to live in the social, because they recognize that the digital is this other level of reality that they don't need nor want. And I wonder, you know, I want to go, well, no, the last thing I want to do is spend another day on Zoom. The last thing I
want to say something about again, the differences in these forms of communication. One of the things that I think happens, and it's sort of interesting to think about, is veracity or the ability to deceive. And I think that there's something about the internet, social media, that has allowed us to begin to simultaneously assume multiple identities and positionalities, you know, avatars, and the whole conversation that's going on now about, can you believe Trump, for example? Can you believe what people are saying? And the doubting that didn't take place earlier, and even through the mediation of television, there was somehow a belief that the person you were standing in front of, and I think that still is part of this innate thing that you're talking about, that the person standing in front of you is more trustworthy somehow, more believable. But the fallacy of that is that we tend to stand in front of people in our own groups. So if I go to my hometown, which is very reactionary, working class, and Trump voter type people, they don't stand in front of people like me that often. They stand in front of people that reflect their reality.
Of course.
So I think I think the internet and social media has kind of enhanced our suspicion of truth, of what's true and not true.
Is that a bad thing?
It could be argued both ways. I don't usually make judgments on
No.
one side or the other.
Merely trying to extend the conversation rather than get a specific answer.
Right.
Yeah, I wonder, Claudia, do you kind of have any responses to? I mean, you've spoken before that you freely admit that you're not that comfortable in the digital realm, and you kind of get the younger folks to do it. Do you as a curator or as an organization, are you suspect of the digital in the ways that you're not suspect of the real world?
I'm probably not suspect, and you know, to quite some extent, I have used it for a long time because I have lived in many different places. And for example, drinking a glass of wine with my friends back in Berlin is something I've been doing for 10 or even 15 years. I don't know how long Skype is around, you know. So that's definitely not new to me, and I think I've been using this much longer than most people around me. Yeah, it is probably more the speed, how new things come in and more opportunities, and how to do it better and faster is kind of disconcerting sometimes, and to always, it doesn't come sort of second nature to that speedy learning. But I actually wanted to turn the conversation to something that Iman, the artist that we are currently working with, he's called Iman Tajik, and he comes originally from Iran. And he navigated the immigration orbit coming from Iran to Britain via land and stayed quite some time in Calais. And then eventually somehow managed to get here. And he is now, he was a refugee and is now actually has studied art and in fact, even got this year British citizenship. And he's our artist in residence at the moment. And we had to make the residency digital because he's based in Glasgow now. And we did do this project that I just suggested, this slow marathon. So initially we wanted to do a marathon walking to Dungavel Removal Center, where many, many refugees are held before they, as the center, before it was called detention center, now they call it removal center, before they're basically removed from the country. And they are refugees. Now, this was in collaboration with Glasgow International. Glasgow International cancelled the festival. And so we had to kind of rethink. And instead of cancelling, we came up with this global slow marathon. And we're still very much thinking, how do we make that socially engaged and so on. But one thing he pointed out to me, I'm getting to it, is that he says, Claudia, this is not new for me. I have been living like this for many, many years now. I haven't seen my parents for 8 years. I haven't seen my sister for all this time and all my friends. So working like this is totally normal for me. It's absolutely not different than how he has been living. And so it is the case for many, many refugees around this country and around the world currently. So many people who are actually in the worst of all poverty traps are living like this, and it is not a new thing. And it's funny, I just wanted to tell a little funny story because you talked about emojis. So we set up this app, and it was quite difficult to set up the app on our website, and how to you had to sort of make say, oh, I'm this name, Iman Tajik, and then you had to quickly sort of say who you are or what you like about this. And because he doesn't like writing, he put emojis in, and then the whole website collapsed. And and so we then talked to the web designer, and he just said, "Well, I'm sorry, I just can't do this. Not in this time frame, and not in this money." And so he has to use words. I just thought I'd bring this in as a
that the website can't handle emojis. The language it's created to work on doesn't actually function on it. I've noticed there's quite a few chats. I know that we're sort of thinking of wrapping up in 15, 20 minutes, whatever. There's quite a few questions that have come on, and I do want to apologize that if we don't get to all of them. But one of the questions that maybe will spark sort of a variety of differences between the panelists is a question for Virginia Hutchinson. What place do art objects and the experiences we have with them have in an environment that may rely on more digital textures? You know, that question of engaging with it, with the actual object, you know, be that a piece of public art or be that some sort of mechanism by which we engage with the tangible have in this current time, or do you kind of just see that that's just another thing to adapt to, and that's not going to be a problem, it's just going to be a process of transition?
I would,
or not an interesting question.
No, I think it's a valid question, but there are also just really two different things. If I ever get the chance to travel again, considering COVID, but when I travel, I like going to see exhibits and I like to interact with them, and I love it. But when I'm at home, I can't. So I don't. And that doesn't require a transition. That just is a matter of accessibility and availability. There might be more of a shift towards digital because it's very accessible, as in everyone can have it, as opposed to not everyone being able to visit the Guggenheim. But that won't invalidate the Guggenheim and the works that are displayed in the Guggenheim. But so there doesn't need to be a transition.
But I suppose there's a subtext of a question that was asked by Gillian, who says that do the panel artists expect a shift from an artistic final outcome from the physical to the digital? And do you think this will be favored with funders, you know, in terms of a sort of oncoming crisis where there's not going to be, you know, money? Do you kind of see then a shift of then everyone saying, well, actually, no, everything has to be digital from now on because it's cheaper and more readily accessible?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Very good. I don't know, but I don't know.
Well, I think there will be more of a shift to the digital, for sure, because this is what we are left with at the moment, at least. And I think actually that's good, because I think there has not been enough attention to creating digital work. And that is, I think, because it's hard to measure success. If you create a physical product, even if it is a film, you have a finished product that you can touch and give to people or you know, hand around. But a website or a platform, yeah, when is it successful? Has the money been well spent? These things are very hard to measure. But because we're forced to look more at the digital because we're all stuck at home, it means that we'll more likely develop measures of success for digital products, and therefore probably see more money spent on digital products. And I think that's great.
Suzanne, did you want to come in?
Well, I mean, I think the art market is going to still maintain a strong relationship to objects. So the question you're talking about now, we might see more digital art, but I think that's like more performance art or more engaged art, you know, process-based art. I think those are all kind of a kind that it's very hard for the art world to put its hands on process-based work. I mean, we've struggled with that for a very long time, and a few artists have been successful entering the market, like Tino Segal, with process-based work. But I think that fundamentally there will still be objects, and that the digital, but I do think the digital is going to enable us, those of us who travel so much, to think about other forms. I've been thinking about how do I organize remotely, and I'm working on a project with the Manchester Art Gallery right now with older women, and we called it ironically Uncertain Futures before COVID. And we had a plan where we were using research methodology to bring people to the gallery. And now I'm resisting going online with this project. One, because most of the women we were working with are not digitally sophisticated. It was a very diverse and different classed project. But I also am not sure, I don't want to just leap to that. I mean, it makes a lot of sense with what I was doing in Russia. I'm not really sure it makes sense in the same way, but then rethinking, can these older women show up in the middle of an art gallery at the end of a pandemic, because we will come to an end of it, is, I think, a big question. So it may change our working methodologies. I'm not sure if it's really going to fundamentally interrupt the art market.
Yeah, you mentioned there was it was an interesting article by Nicholas Berger relating specifically to theater, but I think it had quite a resonant thought to me in terms of all kind of creative practice, was that he was questioning the need for everything to be online. You know, suddenly there were all these theaters who were going, well, we can't have a theater, we can't have a gallery, let's just put it online. And that kind of just built up a huge practice of works that weren't designed to live in the online realm. They weren't designed to exist in that space, and therefore were just of second-rate quality because they didn't.
But on the other hand, there's a lot of experimenting. There's a play that's going on in I think Beverly Hills right now, Santa Monica, where there are people that buy tickets get little packages in the mail, and they're trying to think about ways that they can interact through these packages in the mail with what's going on in the theater. So I think we're just in a moment of great experimentation.
Absolutely, and I think the works that were in, and I know a few people in Edinburgh, because obviously all the Fringe and the festival and all the massive performances that happen here are being sort of cancelled. They're, you know, really creatively then taking up the ways of how they can use the platforms for the platforms that they have, and so they're not just saying, actually what I'll do is I'm going to just stick a camera on, I'm going to just look at the theater online, but I will use that context in the way that it needs to be used. And I suppose that kind of goes back to some of the stuff that would be really interested in I guess coming to a conclusion of in some ways, or an understanding of, is that can we think of the digital as can we think of the ways that we share, all the multiple ways that the digital can be used, in order that we're not just replicating the haptic in the digital? You know, we're not just taking the traditional ways that the haptic is and saying, well, let's just do that in a digital world. Actually, what we're saying is kind of what Suzanne said earlier, is that we're keeping them very separate. They do very different things. But perhaps what we don't have in the digital is the examples of the different types and the different ways that these sort of resources are happening. And that's something that we need to maybe work on. I don't know.
Well, in cataloging it and experimenting with it, but I think what Andrea and I were trying to do was not anything, you know, grand with that piece that I showed you about the Earth Day. It was to simply respond as best we could to a very specific brief, which was let's all respond to Earth Day, and there were a lot of feminists involved. But what we were trying to do was link contemporary feminist artists with a historic piece, Susan Griffin's work, which is one of the earliest works of ecofeminism. And it was done in 1970 something. And so that, you know, that was a little flowery, that quote that they were saying, and certainly not something that one would see contemporarily. It really referred back to, you know, the witches, the covens, and the early feminist goddess organizing, right? But it was a very direct attempt to say, these are artists working now, and this is, Susan was the last person. This is an artist from them, and to link that history and to do it through, you know, cell phone. Mm-hmm. Just sent us in their lines. We gave them lines and they sent us in a line. And so that was, I mean, I don't think that was a great work of art. I think that was an experiment. It was an experiment in communicating with our peers at this moment and referring back to and honoring this woman who is so important from this other era, which frankly is not remembered. And I'll say one thing, that young activists today do not know. I was just talking to Judy Baca this morning, and if you don't know her, you should look her up. She's one of the earliest Chicana muralists, and has done some of the most massive organizing and mural-based work in the world. And we were saying, you know, kids now don't know that legacy, that heritage, and they need to understand. It'll only strengthen their positions.
And that's something I'm, you know, certainly I feel with a lot of socially engaged practice that it's taught, is that we don't really taught the history of it in some ways. We're just sort of expected to go in and do it. Will the same thing happen, I suppose, in a digital context, that we're going to forget the people who pioneered all these digital framings and thinkings, and have, as I kind of regularly do, people showing up and going, oh, I've invented this new thing. No one's ever done it before. And you kind of go, well, actually, someone has.
Yeah,
yeah, or 10 people have.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I just noticed that the 4 officers were charged. I don't know if you guys.
Oh, were they? Okay. No, I didn't know that.
A huge event.
That is, yeah. Sophie's asked a question actually, which I thought would be really interesting, and a couple other people. Sorry, Robin, I know you keep going to that, and then I keep jumping ahead of you, and I'm really sorry for doing that. And some other people have mentioned it, but to kind of draw in the Sophie's question, a few others. I'll just read hers, but then kind of expand it in. She says, as artists, activists, cultural workers, we're often trying to understand, question, resist, and attempt to change the capitalist, environmentally destructive / racist structures under which we work. How do we make sure that we continue to interrogate the digital platforms we are increasingly rely on? And I suppose that goes back to that question, is that digital platforms are not necessarily neutral, and not many people necessarily know that. And so in some ways, are we actually, by using, for example, and I don't know this and I'm not slandering this, but say, for example, Twitter was, you know, an entirely environmentally destructive corporation that never gave anything back and was entirely against a lot of the ideologies that socially engaged practitioners use. And yet we use that platform because it's the easiest. So how do we understand that digital platforms have a politics of themselves? And can we, or is that important in the same way that?
That's called reading.
Yeah, but I suppose, you know, it becomes a tool that we can use. So for example, in Vancouver, where I lived for many years, you know, the local bus service was really atrocious. They didn't treat their workers well, but it was the only way that we could get around town. And so actually that became, we had to use it, even though we didn't want to use it. And even though there were artworks against it, there was no choice. So does Twitter become, you know, because it's the digital platform is our only choice, we have to use that. How do we work with that ideas?
And also,
you don't have to use it. Huh?
Yeah, it's quite a lot of particularly artists who refuse to use certain digital platforms and sort of are immediately excluded by making the artwork, by being politically active at the same time.
But, you know, you're excluding yourself from actually engaging with those people then. You know, it's the same way that I go back to this often time, you know.
Yeah, it's a dilemma. But I mean, if you're sort of politically motivated and you say, well, I'm not using, in fact, there was a big question around Zoom, yeah, and at the moment, and but a lot of people have always refused to use Facebook, and therefore you should refuse to use Instagram. You exclude yourself. This is clear, but it is a dilemma. You know, are you politically conscious or are you excluding yourself?
I'd like to frame this, because I know we don't have much time, as a conversation with Babak and your work on Bolsonaro, because I think that one of the biggest issues that we all have to deal with are these divides and how to actually do something, whether it's for a group of three or for a country. And I'm curious how you're distributing that, how you think that'll actually play out in the public realm in terms of effectiveness. I mean, that's really a kind of a bold statement that you're making with that work.
Well, thankfully, it's not very hard because Bolsonaro is really an asshole. But I get your point. First of all, particularly this work, or you know, it's more like a journalistic piece, but particularly this work, in many ways, is really preaching to the choir, right? Supporters of Bolsonaro are not going to be interested in all the reasons why people want to impeach him. So there's that. But what this does do, or what this piece does or did, is it, for the first time, made accessible all these impeachment requests. So that means that the information that previously was it was not accessible to the public, is now accessible. So it reaches a much broader audience. Also people who might not already were not already against Bolsonaro. It reaches a much wider audience, even though it still, to an extent, reaches only those people who are interested in the potential impeachment of Bolsonaro. But maybe going back a little bit to what Claudia was saying over whether you should choose the inclusion or the boycott, this is the exact same conundrum that individuals or artists in repressive societies have faced forever. I'm from Iran, I'm not a refugee, but many Iranians are refugees, right? Should they stay in Iran and fight the system from the inside, or should they leave and in a way lose relevance within Iran, right? And this applies to every country. Should someone stay, should a Venezuelan stay in Venezuela to fight against Maduro, or should he leave Venezuela and fight against Maduro, but then in a way be seen as a traitor for leaving the country that he's supposed to rescue? So using Twitter or using Facebook, or not using Twitter, not using Facebook, is a similar, although Facebook is no Venezuela, is a similar problem. Do you fight it from the inside, or do you boycott it, hoping that others will follow?
But to me, I think this where did I put that book that I keep wanting to pull up? This goes back to that question of the participation and risky. And I use this example in my lectures all the time. You know, I talk about my grandmother, and my grandmother, you know, all 4'10" of her would have stood in front of a bus and protected me with her dying breath, you know, because she loved me and she thought that but she was also a racist, bigoted Tory. You know, and you know, the reason I want to engage with people is because I want to meet people who are not me, you know,
Yeah.
like that idea of going, well, you are not me. And so when we kind of then reframe that in the digital, I guess that's the question of going, the digital, so far as I understand it, only gives me really opportunities to kind of mostly engage with people who are like me. And that's, I'm not saying I can't, but I guess the current structures of what I have been experienced in are just kind of replicating the silos. And so I'm really interested in then going, you know, like I would really love someone to develop an anti-algorithm for Facebook, which would only give me the feeds of the people who I didn't like, you know, and I'm sure that that's possible.
Exists. So you can, to quite an extent, do this, but it is true that you have to go much more out of your way in the digital realm to find people who are not like you, because by default you're faced with people who are like you or who are enough like you, right? But alternatives exist, right? Specifically in relation to Twitter, the big in the US, the biggest alternative is Gab, right? This is sort of like an alt-right fortress. But there we will find people who are not like us, plenty, right? And it's really not very difficult to interact because Gab, it's really like a mix of Facebook and Twitter. It's very easy to use, but you'll have a bit more of a difficult time to interact with these people because they're very different from who you are, right? But you can make this choice, right? And on Twitter as well, you can engage with people who say things that you really don't understand on a political basis. You can do this, but you have to go out of your way.
And it's easier to do it in person. I mean, I regularly go back home and talk to people who think very differently than I do. And it takes a lot of control to listen and not to put people down, but to keep trying to extract what it is they're feeling and where they're coming from and try to understand. Even though I'm massively pro-abortion, I can have a conversation with an anti-abortionist because I understand that there is a kernel of rationality and in what they're saying. There is, that logically, there is some argument to be made about when life begins. And I happen to take a position around rights and the right of the sentient being, the more sentient being, but I understand that's a position. And so I think that the issue, I tend to watch in the old school way, I flip back and forth between CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News so that I can sort of analyze how stories are being framed. And I think the issue for us is not just listening in on Gab or reading Breitbart, but the issue is how do we create a bridge of communication and listening across the massive divides that exist. And I'm not positive that we can do that. I'm not positive that inequality can really be addressed by the rich listening to the poor.
So one of the comments that we've got is from artist Christine Borland, and she's just I wonder if this kind of mentions a little bit about bridging this gap. She talks about how to build new relationships and create dialogues in work when so many of these meaningful negotiations require the kind of doing nothing time or the hanging out time when you can kind of bridge these gaps with people maybe. And she says most of the good stuff happens by accident through anecdotes and not through the questions that she thought she was going to be asking and having answered. So I just wondered if people had thoughts on this.
Well,
I do. Go ahead, Babak, please.
Oh, thanks. I do have a thought on this. One way in which we as a species create foster relationships is through two things. That is shared achievements and shared suffering. And these are much easier in the real world, right? Because if you both go on a trip and you miss the bus and then you get caught in the rain and you almost die from the cold, you've shared suffering, and that creates a bond. And the platforms where online people make strong bonds is in the online gaming community, where people are constantly talking to each other over Discord or whatever, and really are going through feats of shared achievement and shared suffering because they play on the same team in, I don't know, League of Legends or something, I don't know. They struggle together and they talk to each other all the time and they come up with solutions together and they bond and they have meaningful relationships and it's online. So we need more of that, apparently, to create these bonds.
I just want to be questioned here is that Babak says we all need to be playing more online gaming. Is that kind of fundamentally what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't know, and I don't do it anymore, but I started doing this with Doom 3D, I think it was, which is in the late 90s, right? Which was the first multiplayer, massive multiplayer online gaming environment. And although Discord didn't exist, but these things really they bring people together.
And
because they recreate a situation that we recognize from the real world.
Is that then perhaps something that we can focus on in terms of, one of the questions we are thinking about is, how do we as socially engaged practitioners go ahead with the digital? Is that actually then what we need to think about is how we can use those real life relationship incubators, shared discord or shared pain and shared achievement, as a sort of process. So if we can build those into our platforms, then becomes, as Suzanne's saying, these experimentations that allow us to form and develop those relationships as we go forward.
Yeah.
The other thing I would suggest is that I think in order to be involved with this kind of practice, you have to have a kind of basic curiosity about other people. And I think that if there's a way that we can support listening as a learning activity, and through these medium, and I think Zoom actually does facilitate listening in a very interesting way. I think that kind of inculcate the idea of curiosity. I mean, I really am curious how people on the alt-right believe what they believe. I don't quite understand it. I kind of have some ideas about it, and I think obviously I believe they're sort of ill-informed. But I am curious about how they think and what kind of lives they live. And if you read, there's a lot of work right now in America from sociologists about why the death rates of working class white men, which are higher than they've ever been. And they're talking a lot about how their racial attitudes actually inform their ability to vote against their own interests. They will vote against socialized medicine because they believe it's an inequity that's fundamentally related to race. And so I think that the ability to really listen more deeply to how people who are different than us think is an important skill set to have.
It's also a lot easier online to hang up than it is in the real world, where you kind of have to walk away, and that's quite difficult.
Yeah.
That's something I think that is, I'm not saying that we force people to be online, but if suddenly, I said something that was entirely provocative, it would be very easy for everyone to just go, I don't want to hear you.
But something about being in public, and this is for me as a woman, I don't think it's the same for men at all, but for me to be present with somebody who's arguing something that I really deeply disbelieve in, I can actually touch them.
Yeah.
And my touch will communicate something that's different than what I'm saying.
I would concur with you on that point. Is that, I've always said, and again, I go back to that participation is risky. I would much rather be able to be in the same room with someone who holds the opposite opinion to me, because I think that, whether it's reading the pheromones or whether it's the body language, whether it's I can find a joke and I can read the languages that I can't do online.
Of course, but we're using our white identity if we're talking about white racists, for example, and I think that is also something you have to always be mindful of.
Absolutely.
Presentation.
Can I just sort of barge in here, especially on Babak's? I can't remember this binary thing that you suggested, and I couldn't write it down fast enough, but I think there is a lot in between, and some things are in particular giving time. And when we are in the arts, with artists in residence, nothing is more important than spending time with the artist, and other things that I see sort of, the chats go also really fast, but somebody said important thing is is laughter and jokes, and all these things that come in between. That is also very important, and that is both for our sort of binary thing here, our 50-50 approach, both important with working with the artist as well as with your community. And how do you actually sort of contribute to a sense of community and this sense of place that often is a bit overused terminology.
How do you communicate a sense of place and community?
I'm not saying communicate, but how do you help build?
How do you build that?
Community and a sense of place.
Well, I wonder, you know, again, it goes back to that, and we've had conversations about this all the time, you know, do you, and again, it's my role to be the asshole, as I've written in my papers, the benefits of being a bit of an asshole, you know, is communities already are there, you know, there's no such thing as community, there's communities, and they're already there, you know, they're already linked in some ways. And so communities are never organized by someone else. You can enter into them, you can find a way to enter into them, but you can never create a community that is artificial in some ways. And so I wonder if it's actually just looking in the places where we're not normally looking. You know, are we going to the Dean's Shortbread Factory, which I know is in Huntley, which I know we've tried to work with before, you know, is it about actually creating a work specifically for that community within the larger community of Huntley, and being able to sort of focus a digital project onto them in some ways or else, or can you enhance something that's already there? I just don't know if you can, and maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong in this sense. I don't know if the digital can create a community in some ways.
But you wouldn't talk, nobody will talk about creating a community. I mean, certainly not a sort of meaningful community between people, but
but the online game does, you know, they do.
Sorry, but I just want to finish also something. So but you can actually contribute, you know, that's what you can
so
do.
Contribute. So how can the platforms contribute to this community or this enhancement? Is that the question?
I'm more saying, in what I came from the other side, I'm saying that you need to give time and opportunity for hugs and laughter and for these kind of things in order to contribute to community. So obviously it's a very different way of contributing community that is just on social media.
Maybe I can add to this with a comment that we had from Joss actually, about the idea of being in common. He says, it's a quote, "The individual emerges from an essential sociality rather than the other way around. Here, being with is replaced with being in common, where importantly, being in common does not reduce us to unity of shared essence." So I think that kind of talks about the different kinds of community that you can build, perhaps. And the difference, maybe we should just think about the difference between being with and being in common.
In the sense that a digital, you are more in common than being with.
I think so. I think so. Mm-hmm.
I think that would make a lot of sense to me. I'm conscious that we have over lots and lots of questions, and that we've kind of gone quite a lot over time. I wonder if I don't have any smart, useful way to wrap all of this up. I think that you know, what we've talked about is this idea that there are these diversities of platforms in terms of the haptic and the digital, and that we are learning through them right now, and that they offer different things, but possibly, you know, thinking through I guess some of those questions that Babak were talking about and Suzanne were talking about, of how we can create shared unity between those spaces to be able to use them a bit more effectively in our time. But also maybe it's about just thinking about all the different types of resources that are already existing. You know, it's not difficult for us to share, as Suzanne's beautiful video did, you know, to share with our screens and our cameras, to be able to build things as well. And I think there's also questions about, you know, how we could address accessibility and poverty, digital poverty going forward. But I think hopefully that has been an interesting discussion. I don't know if the panelists have any last sort of thoughts or questions they want to sort of add in or throw towards us.
I would like to say something. And this is, of course, the first time we do this kind of thing like this in a bigger way. And I'm glad it worked out, and I'm glad a lot of people are participating. But for me, it is actually really sad to not to see other people's faces right now, and not to be able now to go for a drink, and that we can keep on having the discussion afterwards. So I don't know, there are ways of encouraging people to do this, but it's rather depressing, actually. And I just thought I'd say that. I'm not really depressed, but it is. Well, I'm not convinced it's an alternative. So, because I would have loved to see all the people that are here today. And in fact, I have very little clue until I go to the list from Eventbrite.
I feel similar, yeah.
And other people don't even have the chance to look at the list. So I would like to say that, but otherwise, it's enjoyed talking to you, and I will very much enjoy looking at all the questions afterwards, and we'll try to maybe respond to some if people want that.
Suzanne or Babak, are you okay to pass back to Robin, or would you like to say something?
I would like to thank Claudia and Robin for hosting this, and Anthony, you for moderating the conversation. And Babak, it's really great to see both yours and Anthony's, and Claudia, of course, I know your work, but to see the two of your work, it's great. And I hope we can stay in touch. I appreciate the conversation. I've learned a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to reflect that as well. I'm very happy for having been here. Thank you, guys. And I would like to also attach something to what Claudia was saying about the people that we don't get to see. One of the things I was actually hoping is that I was going to see, well, now it's 126 other little images on my screen so that I could look at all the faces of the participants, but I only see 5. So that also makes me a little bit, or 4 besides myself, which also makes me a little bit sad. I think I want to reiterate where we started, I think, where the question was about whether the digital can reproduce the physical. And I don't think it can, but it's a hugely important tool that has its own purposes and uses that really can do much more, as well as it can do much less than the physical. But because it can do much more, it can do many different things that are not automatically possible in the physical. Yeah. So.
I think I say this to my students a lot in the time of COVID. You know, they're saying, oh, we can't do this, and we can't do this, and I can't do this. And I've had to say, actually, it's not that we have less resources, we have different resources.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's how we need to think of the digital. It's not that it's not a lesser, it's different.
Yeah.
I'd like
in some ways, much more, really, in some ways, much more. There's so many things that we can only do because of access to digital tools.
So I'd just really like to thank Babak and Suzanne for coming in from your different time zones and your different places, and to Claudia as well. And I'll pass back to Robin to finish off with the last few little bits. There's one or two more things. Take it away, Robin.
Thank you, Anthony. You're about to see some questions pop up. So we would really appreciate it if everyone can just take a minute, take a quick look at these questions and answer them as best you can. I think they do reflect quite well what we've been talking about tonight. So I'll go through them and read them as well, if that's right with everyone. So the first question is, have you taken part in socially engaged art online already? And then we have the answers, yes. I might like to tell you about it more. So please do email us any further questions to info@deveron-projects.com. And let's just keep this conversation going. As Niamh said in the chat, we're using this hashtag being social, so hopefully we can continue this conversation. Second question is, are digital means satisfactory for the delivery of socially engaged art projects? And this is a yes, no, or sometimes I don't know. Third question is the digital a suitable replacement for face-to-face socially engaged practices? Something that's been discussed a lot this evening. Question 4, does the digital focus too much on the global and not enough on the local? And again, we have a yes, no, or I would like to think about this more. Question 5, following our conversation, do you think adopting digital means in socially engaged arts can better and more powerfully address local, global, social injustice? Some interesting answers in this one. And the last question is, as a reflection of what you've heard today, will you be able to think more about how the digital can be adapted to socially engaged art? And again, that's yes, no, and not sure. And we would welcome as many responses as you would like to give to info@deveron-projects.com. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, all. Bye. Have a lovely day. Oh, yeah. Robin, one of the questions that just to remind you that the recording will be available somewhere.
Yes, somewhere. The recording and a transcription will also be available very soon.
Thank you very much.
We will alert people that have joined us today about that once it's available.
Definitely. Goodbye.